This is season 3 of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. And this season, I'm super excited. I get to have a co-host, a guest commentator, a friend, someone who's going to ask questions. Jamie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, hello, everybody. I am Jamie Almanzan. I am a partner and equity coach for the Equity Collaborative. We are an organization that supports public systems throughout the nation to better serve its constituents, particularly the most marginalized. I'm so honored and excited to be a part of this with you, Peter.
I got feedback from somebody in New York who he has his own podcast. And he's like, loved Casey. Oh my God, it's so great. I had to go back a couple times to make sure that was the Casey one because I was confused. You were talking about peanut butter. I was like, okay, we're trying to be more personal. Like, you know, the people get to know us similar to Conan Needs a Friend or Smartless or If Books Could Kill, you know, just sort of an opening where people talk to each other. And so I think we could probably make it really clear, like you found the right podcast. And today we're going to talk with Doug Reeves, and that's in a minute. But beforehand, Jamie, how you doing?
I'm okay. I am looking forward to the holiday break.
Good.
Much like everybody else. In fact, I was coaching a team of principals at an elementary school today, and I asked how they were doing, and they all said, looking forward to the break.
Yeah, it is so important. I was talking to an educator yesterday, and we were just reminding ourselves about how we have to temper our enthusiasm about the holidays because so many of our kids, this is a really unsettling time. This is not a time
Correct.
of celebration and rest and relaxation and family and food. In fact, all the insecurities come to life. Food,
Correct.
housing insecurities. So all of that can be really scary.
Negative family dynamics are part of it. Like any number of negative things are highlighted during this time.
Yeah.
100%. Totally. And on that note, let's talk about Doug Reeves.
Okay. Let me tell you a reason why I wanted to talk with Doug Reeves. Not just because he is a powerhouse. Right. Yeah. He's Doug Reeves. The real reason is I heard him talking about the importance of standing up for educators. And because he's Doug Reeves, he's able to say some of the things that we all are saying, and he's heard. So when he says, if we don't make our profession a safe place to be, then what we think today is a teacher shortage and an administrator shortage, no, that could be a Sunday school picnic. And I was like, oh my God, yes. Because everyone's like, wow, how are we going to recruit more teachers? How will we retain them? You're not going to. They've never made it harder than it is today to be a teacher or an administrator, and you're making it more difficult.
Yes. You are talking about the actual destruction of the profession. 100%. I loved when he said that. I thought that was great. I loved the comment he made about getting agreement from your board that says, yeah, this is where we'll draw the line. Yeah, you may not go to his or her house. That's not okay. I'm like, I'm all in on that.
Well, I thought also that you serving as a coach and with such a national presence and the people I've gotten to know who are coached by you hold you in such high esteem. It's so cool. And Doug talks about the importance of coaching that's done in the game, in the classroom with teachers and leaders during meetings, providing candid, authentic feedback. And I thought to myself, oh, Jamie's got to be eating this up because it's like, well, you can't go to a PD session and be told, this is what you should do, and let me know how that goes. But rather, really seeing it and doing it in real time.
Real time. Now, I actually thought it was funny that his book is called Fearless Coaching. And I'm like, it actually should be, it's fearless for the person being coached, not the coach. The person being coached is where you have to be fearless because you're examining your own flaws, the things you want to be better at, the things I'm saying that I identify. I'm like, no, I'm not good at this. And Peter, will you help me think about getting better at that? And every time you ask a question, there's a little part of me that goes, I didn't do that well. Gosh, over and over and over until I do it better. And this is I love that part when he talked about that. I love the part about coaching is the coach asks, he said, the coach asks questions and everybody else has answers.
So how about this? Let's go to the conversation with Doug Reeves.
We'll listen to strong advocacy of leaders, advice on coaching, and an after-action review that I know you had some opinions about. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.
Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Doug Reeves is my guest. Dr. Reeves is the author of more than 40 books and more than 100 articles on leadership and education. He has twice been named to the Harvard University Distinguished Author Series and was named the Brock International Laureate for his contributions to education. And in preparing for our conversation, I learned something about Dr. Reeves that I had previously not known, and that he was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for his service with the United States Army's military intelligence. That will become relevant in a moment. Dr. Reeves, welcome to An Imperfect Leader. Well, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be with you, and I really appreciate your service to superintendents. It's a tough and lonely job right now, and they need your support. Whew, it is a tough and lonely job. Doug, there are a million things I want to talk to you about. And the first thing I do want to ask you about, and why I mentioned your military service in the intro, because I sense this is deeply personal to you, is a recent article that you authored, We Censor Ourselves in Education. And a note to the listeners, I'll make it available in the show notes. But in the article, you hook the reader by describing a former intern that you had while you were in China and how she had gone on to anchor the news on the China Central Television. And she told you and your colleagues at a forum in Cambridge, we have no censorship in China. And then you wrote, well, when she was challenged at this evidently absurd statement, she replied, all right, we don't need censorship in China because we censor ourselves. And you use this as a launching off point to describe how we have done something similar in our country in what one might call abdication when it comes to supporting critical thinking in our schools. What compelled you to write this piece? Well, because that's precisely what is happening right now. I see teachers and administrators censoring themselves because they fear that any step outside of whatever local orthodoxy is, there will be hell to pay on social media. People show up at board meetings, they are abusive. And I think for the audience of superintendents, their number one job today is protecting their staff from threats, from intimidation, whether it happens during a board meeting, whether it happens in school visits, whether it happens on social media. If we don't make our profession a safe place to be, then what we think today is a teacher shortage and an administrator shortage is going to be a Sunday school picnic. It's going to get worse if job one is not providing both physical and psychological safety for our staffs. It's interesting. I had a board meeting where an individual came to the podium and she said, Dr. Stiepelman, if I were married to you, I'd divorce you. And I think you're a chicken. And then she put on this massive chicken head. And it happened to be a time where it was during the pandemic, we all were wearing masks. So, all of our mouths were just like, but luckily, shielded by these masks. You're so right in terms of how our people are just absolutely being battered and bruised by this notion that anyone can say whatever they want and that the public educators aren't people and that they're not actually trying to do exactly what we want them to do, everything for children. And it makes their job so much harder. So when you talk about that, what does that sometimes look like in terms of support? Actually, chicken hats are pretty benign by today's standards, honestly.
Yeah, it's true. I've talked to some that said, I'm a pacifist, but I went and got my first gun license. I went, oh my gosh, okay.
Well, and following, board members and superintendents and teachers out to their parking lot, to their cars, I know where you live, then posting. I had a superintendent the other day tell me that after his home was posted on social media, he woke up the next day to see his entire lawn strewn with trash. Now, look, superintendent, they've got a thick skin. They're used to taking criticism, but that's on us. When you cross the line to our families, to our homes, that is crossing the line. And my candid advice to every superintendent is you got to forge an agreement with your board chair that if they don't get this under control,
then you're gone. And we're already seeing enormous superintendent turnover and administrator turnover. And the reason is not that they're cowards, it's that they draw the line and attacks on their homes and their families. And that's got to come to a halt.
Doug, in my book and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension. It's called nested patterns. And that's really the muscle of an organization's work. And actually, it speaks to Peter Senge's systems thinking question, how do we want to be together? And inside that dimension, there are terms with which you have discussed as an author and as a speaker, terms like creativity and courage. For example, in your book, Beyond Conversations About Race, you and your co-authors step into a fairly complex national dialogue, and I really believe that took courage. Terms like high levels of collaboration from leading to succeeding. You remind readers that trust is built when decisions are made collaboratively. And Carol Dweck's term, growth mindset, is visible in your book and in your work, but in your book, Deep Change Leadership. You've referenced the fixed mindset paralyzing educators, even when research disputes deeply held beliefs, right? Reading instruction, for example. So my question is, because I started this podcast to support leader longevity, and because so many of our district leaders who listen to this podcast have roles where they coach and they support collaborative teams, I wanted to ask you about your book, Fearless Coaching, written in part to stem the tide of burned out educators. Would you talk a bit about what you've noticed about the turnover of leaders at all levels and how that has resulted in what you and late Rick DeFore referred to as PLC light?
Yeah, well, first of all, let's get clear about our definition of terms. The word coaching is what Harvard Business Review called the Wild West. Everybody wants to be a coach. Everybody has a coach, but nobody can articulate what it means. So what I attempted to do in the book, Fearless Coaching, is to say, here's what coaching is, and here's what it's not. It's not your buddy. It's not your therapist. It's not your consultant who will steal your watch and tell you the time. The fundamental issue is a coach asks questions. Everybody else has answers. And if you're really focused on building capacity on the client that you are coaching, all you want to do is have them get refocused on their primary objectives and ask questions about how they can do better next month than they did this month. I had a coach for many years, and Julie Wolfe was so lucky because she was a sort of challenging coach, not your buddy, not your therapist, but would say, Doug, you've raised the same issue for the last 3 months. How's this month going to be different? And that's what I think a good challenging coach would do. Moreover, I think there's a lot of money and time wasted on coaching at the instructional level that I don't know what it is, but it's not coaching. If you're not in the game, that is, you're present in the classroom with children present, I don't know maybe it's a conversation, but it's not coaching. It's only coaching if you're in the game with children present. For a teacher, if you're in the game with the superintendent during a cabinet meeting, it means you're really supporting that person and providing candid, authentic feedback. So that's at least what I attempted to do in that book.
I really appreciate that. And truly, one of the things I noticed when I was a principal and then certainly as a superintendent as well is the amount of money that is spent on coaches, and often without a definition of what that role will look like, without a shared image of what success is. And often what happens is the coach spends most of their time working with those who might not need coaching, because that's where the individual says, yeah, come on into my classroom. And so they work with those who are most successful as opposed to those who might need additional support. But the person who needs support doesn't know what they need, doesn't know how to ask. And the person coaching, some have gone through cognitive coaching and things like that, or Elena Aguilar's work, and they have some frames to use, but not totally sure how to support. And so it's interesting how much money is spent on coaching.
You've articulated really well the central weakness of a lot of instructional coaching, that's that it's voluntary. And it's what Rick DeFore used to call private practice. My classroom is my domain. If I don't want to coach, I don't have to get a coach because it's voluntary. And the late Dick Elmore was so brilliant in articulating the need for instructional leadership, but you can't be an instructional leader if you're not in every single classroom. And if you haven't created a safe environment for every classroom door to be open, every opportunity for observers, coaches, and especially instructional leaders and administrators to go into any classroom in a safe way. It's not evaluative, it's not punitive, but it's got to have the opportunity to improve things. And I'm in way too many schools where the classroom is hermetically sealed from outside observation. That is the very definition of a fearful environment rather than a fearless environment.
That's interesting. And we walk in and then we say, well, we'd like you to be vulnerable now. Are you ready? Ready? Be vulnerable now.
Well, and I want to be really fair to teachers who are skeptical about hearing the imperative that we have to be. We have been through decades of instructional rounds and learning walks and walkthroughs.
Right.
And I wrote the endorsement for instructional rounds, did Elmore and Elizabeth City's work. And I believed it in theory, but in practice, what happened is 3 blind men and the elephant. You got the suits in the back of the room, and one sees the tail, and one sees the trunk, and one sees the side, and they walk out with 3 totally different ideas of what they saw.
Yeah.
So I really believe.
And they ask one kid, "What are you learning?" And the kid goes, "I don't know." And they go, "Oh, clearly the learning target has not been articulated." Where it's like, you asked the one kid, right? Sort of like with the pencil up his nose. What are you doing?
We can get better at this. I know it can be done better. And I just think back to the role of the superintendent, helping our building administrators be effective instructional leaders is job number one. We've got to make sure that they can articulate what good instruction is, and they can then use it in a respectful and coaching-centered way to make instruction get better, and not periodic evaluations that are adversarial, but literally every week. Kim Marshall's brilliant work on this, rethinking teacher leadership and supervision. Kim says you got to be there every day. You got to be seeing individual teachers at least once every week or two. So it's not an exceptional activity. It's not everything comes to a halt. It says, "Good morning, Mr. Marshall. Hope everything's okay." But it's just the natural flow of the day. And similarly, I think our superintendents need to help our new teachers understand, when I walk into the classroom, it's not going to be an adversarial experience. It's not judgment. I just want to see what's going on. I had promised that I'll tell you same day, face to face, what I saw, what I didn't see. And I'll get off my high horse on this and just one more statement on classroom observation. You probably, because you're obviously reading a lot of stuff, and it's so kind of you to mention the things that you've read of mine. But you may recall the article, "What I Wish My Principal Saw." And it was by this 5th grade teacher who had the principal come in and was observing, taking notes. And then this kid gets up and leaves the room. And the first thing that this teacher gets, so the written feedback is, "Student left class without permission." What she said is, "What I wish my principal knew is this kid had a UTI, urinary tract infection, had to go to the bathroom a lot. And we wanted to work out a system because 5th graders will snicker at that." Oh, yeah. So it was, "Hey, got to go, okay to go," and no disruption, no snickers, no everything, just creative, compassionate, thoughtful teaching. And what I encourage observers, including superintendents, to do is, before you say anything, ask the teacher, "What did you see?" Because I know you probably saw more than I did. What did you see? So you're saying lead with curiosity as opposed with judgment. Exactly correct. Yes. Yeah. What does the term an imperfect leader mean to you? How does it resonate for you? So you mentioned Peter Senge earlier.
I saw you smile.
Yeah, well, Senge and I were stuck in a torrential monsoon rainstorm in Singapore where we had both keynoted this event. And there weren't any cabs around. So when a cab came up, I said, "Okay, I got 30 minutes with the godfather of systems thinking to say, okay, Dr. Senge, what can you tell me to narrow down? Because I've read the books. I think I've tried to understand it." And he said, "Doug, it's just 2 things. Number 1, everything's connected. And number 2, back to your question, admit what you don't know." The essential part of systems thinking is admitting what you don't know so you can look for other connections. And I'll give you a contemporary example of that. Too many districts have a problem with discipline, and then another problem with chronic absenteeism, and another problem with student achievement. And they'll create 3 different task forces for those 3. But if we listen to Peter Senge's advice about everything's connected, that would all be one task force. If you want to have, for example, better discipline, have fewer failures. You want to have better attendance, have fewer failures. The root of all those things is making sure that we lower the failure rate and lower the hopelessness rate, because at the root of chronic absenteeism and bad discipline is this hopelessness that our students feel when they say, "Hey, my goose is cooked. The electronic rating system is going to use the average, so it doesn't make any difference what I do. I might as well give up."
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley.
I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Dr. Doug Reeves, a teacher, a leader, and an author of books and articles on leadership and education. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they've had to make, and then we discuss it. So Doug, what happened?
Well, I've had what happened in my life is nothing but dumb luck, I must say. Not terribly strategic. But as you mentioned earlier, I did have some military experience. And when I started school, the Vietnam War was still raging. And my father brought us, the 3 boys, together and said, "Well, boys, do you want to walk or do you want to ride?" We said, "Well, sir, we think we'd rather ride." And he said, "Then I suggest you become an officer," which is what all 3 of us did. And so I managed to get commissioned literally 18 days after the fall of Saigon. So instead of getting sent to Vietnam, I got sent to Germany, where we were dealing with the students and soldiers who had come out of that pretty difficult experience, many of which had promises made to them. "Oh, my recruiter told me that I was going to go to college. My recruiter told me that I'd go to medical school, and here they are sitting in an artillery battalion in the middle of nowhere." So I took it upon myself to be a teacher. And literally every evening, we brought those young soldiers together who wanted to get college credit to teach advanced placement classes, to teach college credit classes, so that they could believe that the government stood by its promises. And it fell upon me to deliver that. There's nothing I should add that the government ever asked me to do. I just felt an obligation morally to do that. So that was my first experience with teaching under fairly problematic circumstances. Later on, my first teaching experience in schools was a middle school experience, where I came to the principal all ready to show my credentials and show my lesson plans and everything else. And Mr. Robinson said, "Actually, do you know anything about the Pythagorean theorem?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I pretty much do." And he said, "Let's go down to room 103. I want you to teach a lesson right now." That was the end of my interview. He watched me. He said, "You can stay for the rest of the day." And what turned out is that my predecessor had simply left the building because he couldn't deal with middle school kids. And I love those kids, and I love that school. So that's part of my passion for really appreciating teachers and leaders who have their hearts and their priorities in the right place. So let me stop with that. Those were 2 very formative experiences for me.
I think most can relate to the middle school experience, particularly. I mean, there's a special place in heaven for any kindergarten teacher and anything middle school. So I really do kind of want to delve into the work that you were doing in Germany and understand that a little bit more. So the fall of Saigon happens 18 days before you're deployed. You now find yourself in Germany. There are soldiers who are there who are convalescing. I mean, these are injured soldiers, and those who have sort of been moved to medical hospitals or tell me more about that.
They had injuries, but they were all covered up. So, for example, my driver was a heroin addict. I had a number of soldiers who had never learned to speak English. We had people from Kentucky who had never lived with a black person before, and people from Harlem who had never interacted with white people before. There were both psychological and physical ailments that affected them, but none of these were getting treatment. This was just,
okay, so you arrive, and what you start to hear is, "I've been promised all of these things." And you take it upon yourself as an officer to begin convening soldiers to do some instruction as a way to make good on a promise that they had received.
That's exactly what I did. And I want to give credit to these soldiers, because all of us had been up since 5 o'clock in the morning doing everything from maintenance to training and everything else. So these classes were at night. So these are people who are willing to work very long days. And I honor those soldiers, because that kind of work ethic is what is going to sustain them, whether or not they ever get a college degree for the rest of their life.
Yeah. So using your father's story in a way, that they were walking, but they wanted to look to the future so that they had an opportunity to ride. So as you're looking back on this, what got overlooked?
I learned so much. I have much more gratitude to the military than any resentment. I do think what got overlooked is that we never really felt as a country fully accountable to our Vietnam veterans for the things that drew them into the service and then that we failed to provide. I also think what got overlooked is that when the draft ended in 1973, we lost the opportunity to have kind of the equal participation in conflict. I think we would have a different foreign policy in the last several decades if rich kids and poor kids both had the opportunity or the requirement to serve in the military. Right now, that requirement falls disproportionately on poor kids because they see the military as a source of education, which is great. But I don't want to get overly political about this, but I just think that service, and I'm agnostic about whether it's military service, education service, hospital service, but if every student had an obligation to serve their country, we would have a different ethic of service in this country than we have right now.
I mean, you look around the world, so many countries have some type of military service requirement, or you can go into teaching, you can go into social work, you can go into other types of service industries to be able to provide and support your country and others.
By the way, can I apologize for interrupting you, but you said something really important. I was just writing earlier today that we need a GI Bill for education. So I'm not saying people have to go into the field artillery, but if you're willing to say, I'm going to serve my country as an educator for 5 years, then you ought to be able to graduate debt-free from college. And our country has got the resources to do that. We're facing a calamity in teacher shortage right now. And if we would provide a GI Bill for teachers, just like we should have a GI Bill for nurses and a GI Bill for people in the military, then or the Peace Corps. I'm sure we could think of many avenues for public service, but our country desperately needs to provide a way that makes teaching a more attractive opportunity that also relieves them of, we're expecting teachers today to have 6-figure debt and a 5-figure income. There's, 20 years later, they're still paying off those debts.
That's exactly right. You're really highlighting something fairly important, particularly the wage discrepancy, right, in terms of what they pay to become a teacher and then their earning potential over time. And you can't say that it's because you have such a great pension that's the reason why you should do it. And I mean, historically, right, it was just a career only exclusively for women. And they'd say, well, I'm sure their husbands will provide for them. And it's such an insult in terms of how much education is required to get into the profession and to do a good job. And then at the beginning of our conversation, in terms of the kind of abuse that they take from the public, and to think that it's okay. So I totally agree. So here you are, you're teaching in the evenings, you're working with servicemen, you're highlighting some pieces that may have been overlooked. And I'm kind of curious, what did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
It's interesting how all these things get connected. What I learned most about relationships is that I had great commanders, and a couple of things. One of which is when you mess up, you admit your mistakes early. Part of the essence of the book Fearless Schools is a fearless classroom, a fearless school, a fearless district is where it's safe to admit a mistake. In fact, on the leadership performance matrix, which I'd be happy to share with you because it's free and open source, the lowest level of resilience, which is the first dimension, is covering up mistakes. And the next to the highest level is admitting mistakes. But the very highest level is publicly admitting them and help the entire system learn from them. And a superintendent friend of mine, Dr. Mike Wasta, published what he used to call oopsgrams, where, hey, district, here's the 3 biggest bloopers I made in the last week, and here's how we can all learn from them. I think great leaders are not perfect. It's the essence of your podcast.
I was going to say, that's why it's called an imperfect leader. It's not called an incompetent leader. It's imperfect. It's serving as a lead learner and saying, I made a mistake, and here might be some opportunities for us to make a mid-course correction, and I need your help to do that. I want to share the leadership in fixing this.
Absolutely. That is the essence. Scientists say that we learn more from error than from uncertainty. You can't be a good scientist if you don't make mistakes and learn from them and then publish your mistakes so everybody else learns from them as well. We need more of that in leadership. We need less of these how great I am success stories and more, here's the 20 dumbest things that I've done in my leadership career and how I learned from them. And I was lucky enough to have leaders who, instead of punishing somebody for their mistakes, would say, thanks for your honesty. Thanks for your integrity. That's how this battalion is going to move ahead. And I try to do the same thing in education. Whenever I speak, I talk about my research mistakes. It's easy to find people who will talk about only their hypotheses that miraculously turned out to be right. I think what good researchers do is we talk about, here was my hypothesis and I was dead wrong. And here's what we could all learn from that mistake.
So when you think about relationships, it sounds like what you're saying is it's by admitting our mistakes, by acknowledging them, by working through them, that we build trust, and that the people that you've been able to do that with have created these enduring, long-lasting, meaningful relationships.
Absolutely. And I don't want to attribute to myself any particular skill there. I've just been lucky enough to have great colleagues and great leaders that I've been able to work with.
What frustrated you in terms of the story you've been sort of weaving through in this second segment about the work that you were doing in Germany?
What frustrates me is that even when things are obvious, and the same is true then, and it's true in the 21st century with public education, is that even when things are obvious, even when the evidence is clear, people don't always follow it. And so you see that in the military. My elder brother, General Steve Reeves, had a distinguished 38-year career in the military and was one of the nation's leaders during 9/11 and so on. And there were things that obviously needed to be done, and people still wouldn't do it. At the much smaller level where I would see things that obviously needed to be done in terms of literally life-saving maintenance issues. Soldiers died because of a maintenance failure that were completely unnecessary if we'd only followed the checklist and do what needed to be done. Today in education, obvious things. I read a new article about the power of argumentative writing, thanks Johns Hopkins University, that is very similar to what I've written about, the power of nonfiction writing, what many other scholars have tried to do. And yet I go in schools that say, hey, if the state's not going to test nonfiction writing, why do it? Instead of saying, let's do the right thing, because nonfiction writing will help us. We know what the evidence says. You want to ask what frustrates me, back to your question. What frustrates me is people who are indifferent to the evidence. We know what to do and we don't do it. And to the superintendents, that's your greatest challenge. You can't tolerate indifference to the evidence. We got to start being led by what we know works.
Yeah, particularly in a metropolitan district where there's such a revolving door of leaders, that any of these types of changes or approaches take time. And they feel that there's an imperative to move quickly, and so they make very quick changes, or they avoid what really is going to be a sort of a long-term strategy towards long enduring change. So
I don't just sound like such a whiner. Let me give you something positive. The single best propellant of change that I have seen is what we call the science fair for adults. So you don't try to make the whole system change year one, but you start with a group of volunteers, and the price of admission is the science fair. And it looks like a kid's science fair. 3 panels. What was my challenge? Maybe it was 3rd grade math. Maybe it was 9th grade reading, whatever. What was my challenge? What was my practice? Here's how I changed the way that I did homework. Here's how I changed the way that I did feedback. What were my results? So it's challenge, practice, results. So everybody has the same 3 headings. No glitter, no PowerPoint, no ribbons, no decoration, just simple challenge, practice, result. And I'll tell you, as recently as last June, I watched a high school gymnasium full of these displays. And the teachers who would never believe me, never believe an outside study, never read one of my books, never believe any outsider. But the teacher down in room 103, she proved that this change in reading instruction really worked. Worked with our schedule, with our budget, with our bargaining agreement, worked with our culture. Now I believe it. So the propellant for change is not an inspirational speech from Doug Reeves, I regret to say. That the propellant for change is the science fair, where you help teachers learn from one another. And then in year 2, then you can go system-wide. I would also just say to our superintendent listeners, you don't make that happen by begging and appealing for buy-in. You'll never get it. And if I could just say, with all respect to my superintendent listeners, when you tell me that you've got buy-in from everybody, no, you don't. Truth is, what you got is either A, you're not asking for change, or B, all the arguments happen out in the parking lot. So seriously, the way you get buy-in is not from the superintendent and not from me. The way you get buy-in is the science fair, where they get the observational opportunity from one another, and then they have buy-in.
What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
Well, your timing is apt on that, because it comes back to where we started earlier. I was just talking to somebody who was considering applying for a superintendency in a complex and politically fraught district. And what I told this woman is, the following. You can do it. You've got the leadership chops. You've got the experience. I've watched you in action for more than 10 years. I know you can do this, but you can't go in eyes wide shut. You got to go in and saying, if you get offered a contract, you have to have a private conversation with the chairperson of the school board with the following, that, hey, I can take criticism. I can take divergent thinking. That's how adult learning thrives. What I can't take are any threats to me or to my family. And I need your assurance that one of two things will happen. Either A, if those threats cross the line from a criticism of my policy, which I can accept, to criticism of me and my family and threats that accompany that, then one of two things happen. Either A, you shut the meeting down, or A, my contract is over and I get paid for the remainder of it. And I know that's a tough stance to take, and it's hard to do that when you're in the position of applying for a job. But once you get offered that contract, we have to lay the law down, because too often abuse of superintendents has been normalized. Abuse of faculty and building level administrators has been normalized. So the best advice I can give you is, number one, set the boundaries. The other advice that I would offer is let's identify what is the reasonable expectation. Too many superintendents, and this is true of secondary school principals as well, it's become a 24/7 job. If you weren't at the girls' volleyball tournament on Saturday afternoon, you disrespected the women of this district. No, actually, I have a family. I'm not going to spend all my time watching other kids' games when I can't go to my own kids' games, watching other kids' musical performances when I don't get to watch my own kids' recitals. So I think back to the late Dick Elmore, who I honored earlier, and I truly miss. Dick talked about distributed leadership. And what I would counsel those aspiring leaders to do is have a vision clearly about distributed leadership. And that means I'm going to create a team, because I'm not the perfect leader. I'm going to create a team that is complementary, that has different strengths than I do. And we're going to share duties. Yes, there will always be leadership participation in school sports and activities and music and so on, but it's not going to always be me. Yes, we'll be in community activities, but I'm not going to be at every Chamber of Commerce meeting and every Rotary Club meeting. I'm going to distribute that as well. And if I could just offer one footnote to that, I wrote an article with 3 women superintendents called Breaking the Glass Ceiling. Why is it that so few superintendents are women today, and it was the same percentage as it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, and it ticked up, I think, from like 20% to 23%, something just woefully low.
It's crazy, particularly since they are 72% of the education workforce.
Exactly.
What they all said is, I had a superintendent who let me have visibility. He didn't hog the microphone. All of them had men superintendents who let them speak at board meetings, who let them present, and they were not just props in the background. So my argument would be that if we want to broaden the superintendent leadership opportunity, we make it a livable opportunity, not one that sacrifices your family, and one that is broadly inclusive. If we can do those things, that would be my best advice. And I think taking the riff on your podcast, the advice is you walk in saying, guess what? I'm not perfect. There's 8 qualifications for this job. I'm really good at 4 of them. And what I pledge that I will do is build a leadership team that's going to be great at all 8 of those. But I'm not going to be great at all 8 of those.
My guest again today was Dr. Doug Reeves, a teacher, a leader, an author, a speaker on leadership and education. And Doug, this has been an absolute treat. So many educators have looked to you for guidance, for support, for inspiration, and everything I've read about you and by you, and there's always this rallying cry for education truly as a human right. And there's almost nothing more human-centered than that. So really, truly, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, it's my great pleasure. And I must say that I'm deeply honored that you were willing to read some of my books. I really appreciate that.
So we're back, and I'd like to start off with some of your takeaways on coaching. I mean, you're a coach, and so I'm curious about your thoughts.
It's interesting. I did wonder, he named a challenge with coaching, which I think is true, when he was talking about instructional rounds. And he talked about that the inherent challenge is that coaching is voluntary, right? There's no other way to do it. That's the only choice. It has to be voluntary. No one changes by mandate. The best you can get by mandate is...
I was going to say compliance, right? So they can learn how to follow the rules, check the box, fill out the form, turn it in. It's not transformative. It is reform, is what it is. You're reforming behavior as opposed to transforming practice.
To me, this is where I would disagree with Doug in that he's like, that's a challenge. And I'm like, there are examples where the reformation of that behavior has caused for a reflective moment and thus change. But can we not talk about Doug Reeves' after action review?
Of course you can. Go for it.
It was all like, well, the military didn't do a thing, so I stepped.
I really like how we do after action reviews. And I really like the fact that the military invented the after action review process.
I didn't realize the after action review was a military term.
Yeah. Started from the military. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In fact, I was so excited when I was reading Colin Powell's memoir. He said, one of the most powerful tools the Army used to achieve this success was a technique called the after action review, AAR. The AAR concept was first tested and proved at the newly established National Training Center, NTC, at Fort Irwin, California. It keeps going on. The AAR system works because it's a training process, not an evaluation process. That doesn't mean feelings won't be hurt or unfavorable impressions created. The needs of the mission must come first. The AAR process is applicable to any organization that truly wants to know how it is doing, where it needs to improve, and how it can get to the bottom of a problem or dispute. What have we done right? What have we done wrong? The sole goal is to improve our performance, not about your ego or mine. If we're a team, we can level with each other in a spirit of how do we do better?
Right.
So in the spirit of Colin Powell, how did you feel this conversation achieved that?
I love the podcast you created and the term imperfect leader because it reflects so much of what I believe leadership is. I actually use the term humble leadership, which is a derivative or it's a way of thinking about it from how I was raised by my grandfather who preached humility as the primary identity marker. That he used to say, you should never have to tell someone you're smart. They'll know when you speak to them. So why I like the after action review section of this podcast is it's the point at which I give you an example or a story of a time where my humility is primary. I get to say, I really messed this up. My question to Doug would be, is this the most recent example that you've got? It can't be true. It just seems, and if so, wow, like holy moly.
I think he wanted to tell a story that he had not talked about publicly, his time in the military. And I think this gave him an opportunity to do that.
Well, I think you're right. He indicated as he wraps them up, he sort of realizes he doesn't answer the question about or give an example of a thing he would change. Because he says, these are two events that shaped my young identity, career. And I was like, that wasn't the question. The question was, what would you do differently? How would you have handled it differently? And I think what he identified was a issue for the military, that the institution or the system of the military, that he had the privilege, being an officer, to step in and work on that and try and fulfill a very noble promise. I think that's amazing. But I can't see where that messed up. It almost makes me want to ask, like, how many of your students said, this doesn't work for me? You don't work for me. I'm not doing it this way. I understand what you're trying to do, but I'm not doing it this way. If you've got enough students, eventually there's going to be one that says, not you, brother, no matter what. It's because people are people. I'm like, I think I'm a great person. I think I like people. I'm really excited.
You're raising something that I should have asked. Like, so this is amazing what you accomplished. And I imagine there were bumps in the road from everything from supplies to staffing to how about just the very nature that you're working with humans in a hierarchy? So you're an officer, there's a level of compliance that's very different from in a classroom. Like, how do you ensure your students are getting what was promised to them, or that they understood the promise in the same way that you understood the promise?
He says about coaching that you have to be in the game. I have a question. Do the soldiers who were deployed in Vietnam and now with you in Germany feel like you were in the game? Because
that's very interesting. I did not even put that together in my mind of you're returning from Vietnam. Yikes.
Yes.
And now it's,
I am Captain Reeves there's probably some folks that came in there and was like, this guy, or they said, fine, whatever. At least I get the pathway to the education I was promised, or the military promised, as it relates to signing up to go to a war that was a terrible experience. And so I thought that was fascinating. Cool. I do wonder about the whole being in the game. It depends on what you mean by the game. I'd be interested to know that, because there's a piece of that says, I don't actually think it's about the role to me. I don't actually have to be a superintendent to coach a superintendent. What I have to do is be an amazing coach. And that if I can be an amazing coach, I don't need another superintendent. I've got you. I've already got one. Why would I need two superintendents in the room? You don't. You just need to actually help the one that's there to think more clearly about what they want to accomplish. That's what I need to do. Here's where the game does make sense to me. If that superintendent wants feedback or wants to get better at facilitating the board meeting or being a full participant in the board meeting or something, then me being at the board meeting as their coach is where I could give directive observational feedback. But other than that, I actually don't think that. I don't think you need to. In fact, there's often this sense that teachers are like, well, if you haven't taught, you don't understand. I think that is true. You wouldn't fully understand what it's like to lead a classroom, but that doesn't mean that person can't help you get better.
Good point. I think that wraps up Doug Reeves.
Good.
It wraps. This is right before the holidays. So I hope that there's plenty of good cheer and mistletoe. I don't know, do you collect mistletoe? This is where I'm like, what do I know? I'm Jewish. But no coal under your tree.
How come mistletoe hasn't been Me Too'd? I do believe that mistletoe carries some dilemmas.
I'm trying to wrap it up. Stop opening the presents.
Yes. I hope that you have a wonderful holiday. This holiday does mean a lot to me and my family. I grew up with a very, very positive experience with it. And so my trying to replicate that for my family, it's a wonderful time. I'm really excited about it. Always am. And so I feel grateful that I get to do that. It's a very, very privileged position that I'm in.
I love that. I love hearing it. That's wonderful. All right. I'm Peter Stiefelman.
I'm Jamie Mansan.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.